Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about a very what I think is a very interesting topic, and what I hope that you will also think is an interesting topic, which is we're looking at the true history of the origins of Criollo, not just as a species, but the way we use the term in modern parlance. And before we get into today's episode, I want to remind everybody that you can go into the live chat wherever you might be, and the comments, whether it's on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and you can just let me know where in the world you're connecting from. And you can also ask me questions. So if there's something I say, you can go into the chat or the comments and ask it, and I'll get those shout outs and I'll get the comments up on the screen, the questions up on the screen, and I will answer them for you. You can do that at any point during the course of the hour. And before we begin, I also want to remind everybody, that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can go there, and if you're not a member, you can click on the join button. There's always a free membership, but if you do have the resources to support the work I'm doing, monthly memberships start as little as $5 a month. And at the top tiers, when you subscribe annually, those come with consulting hours and coaching hours. So if you've got some aspect of your business that you're interested in getting some input on, becoming a member of the Chocolate Life, supporting the work that I'm doing on the Chocolate Life is a way to get access to my expertise, one-on-one calls that we can engage in where we can address issues associated with your business of any kind, marketing, product development, sourcing, you name it. You can get access to them by becoming a member of the Chocolate Life. And with that, what I want to do is I want to go and jump into today's episode. And this is the post for today's episode. I create a post for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate. It includes links to watch the episode, and it's also a run of show. We're going to talk about what it is that I'm thinking about, so that afterwards, if you want to, what you can do is, or even during the episode, there's now a QR code above my head. You can scan the QR code, and you can go to this page on the Chocolate Life and follow along. Or in the future, you can do that. You can do that as well, whether you're watching it or listening to it. But with that, let's talk about the true history of Criollo, the true history of cacao, the origins of Criollo. So all of this came to mind last week when I received a link to an email, a link in an email to this post. The author of this post, Robert Quebec, is someone I have known for quite some time, at least a decade. I don't know that we've ever met in person, but we've known about each other through social media and other circles, and we've corresponded in the past. And listen, I wanted to read this, and I wanted to know if I could learn something about the origins of Criollo. I don't necessarily so. Let me frame this before I get into it, which is this is part of this larger exercise that I'm involved in, which is to help people understand how to read, how to evaluate claims that they read on the internet. And so, so how do you go and determine as you're reading it whether or not what is being claimed is true or not? And so this is the spirit in which I'm doing this. This is not a takedown of this particular author. It was the inspiration for my exploration, because it turns out that in my researching the answers to this topic, I realized that I was making some inaccurate claims, and I think the most important inaccurate claim is that I was mistaken when I was mistaking the attribution of the words Criollo and Forastero to an earlier time, about a century too early, and in the wrong location. And we'll get to that over the course of it. And that's something that I began to understand as a result of reading this article. And so I want to thank Robert, for the inspiration for me to go and take a look at this. But let's go through a little bit at a time. So, number one, I'm not a huge fan of AI generated artwork. I mean, this is obviously AI generated artwork without attributing it to where it came from. So I don't know if it's from Nano Banana. I don't know if it's from some other model, but this is obviously AI generated. Again, it's the lack of attribution that bothers me more than the fact that it is AI generated. And I'm also not entirely sure that I like the framing, the most mythical cacao bean, which seems to imply that all cacao beans are mythical and just that this one is more mythical than the others. Not entirely sure that I like that framing, but I get where it comes from. And so there is this setup of the narrative. Chocolate lovers often hear certain words repeated with almost reverent tone over the years. So he's got a chocolate shop. Over the years at my chocolate shop during tastings, or simply sharing amazing specialty Damori bar. Damori bars, so a little more editorial. Listen, it's easy to miss that sort of thing. I've noticed that certain words tend to make people lean in just a little closer. Single origin, bean to bar, vintage harvest, and perhaps the most mysterious of all, Criollo. So this is the narrative framing. What is Criollo? Where does it come from? People tend to think about Criollo and, oh, it's like hush, reverent tones. And in that respect, he's probably right. So what exactly is Criollo? And that's where the article starts. So long before chocolate bars or couverture, cacao was a sacred crop in Mesoamerica. Whenever I think about this early history, I'm reminded that chocolate was not even created, but instead prepared as a drink. It was something to be carefully prepared, shared selectively, and experienced fully. Mayan and Aztec civilization cultivated trees, right? Among the cacao genus families grown during the time, one stood apart for its delicate character. That family was what we now call Criollo. And so there are a couple of things that jump out to me here, is that there is several thousand years of history of cacao domestication and use, which predate Olmec, Maïa, and Aztec use of the crops, right? And so none of that is acknowledged here. It's like, the use and appreciation of cacao is a Mesoamerican culture, a Maya and Aztec thing, and it doesn't even mention the Olmecs here. And so there's a little bit about the history. Listen, if all you read was The True History of Chocolate, and that's the homage in the title that I'm working with, if all you read was The True History of Chocolate from Michael and Sophie Coe, this might be what you took away from it, right? But there's a lot of research since the last edition of The True History of Chocolate was published, and our understanding is a little better now. This is where things started to go off the rails for me. So in the modern cacao world, beans are generally grouped into three broad families: Criollo, Forastero, and Trinitario, right? And that is no longer true. So in 2008, Juan Carlos Montemayor and a team introduced a research paper, or published a research paper. It's available widely on PLOS ONE, other sources for academic research, which said that the conventional understanding of Theobroma cacao is wrong. There are two main structure groups. There's a Criollo structure group and a Forastero structure group, and that instead of there being two genetic varieties, there were 10. There are now, since then, research has suggested that there's an 11. So this tripartite structure is one that started crumbling in 2008. And I remember reading this for the first time because it was less than a year after my book Discover Chocolate was published, and Discover Chocolate repeats the Criollo, Trinitario, Forastero idea And less than a year later, no matter how hard you try to write an evergreen book, you know, there's always the possibility that new research will come along and it will change everything about what you're doing, what you thought. And so when I saw this Criollo Forastero Trinitario, what I did is I went down to the bottom of the article and I looked to see if there were any sources which are cited. And there are no sources that are cited for this particular article. So we don't know, right, where this information is coming from. It says, in future, we will continue exploring the broader cacao landscape, including Forastero and Trinitario, which is a great idea. So, but I contacted the author and I said, hey, in future, you might want to cite your sources here so that we can, do a deep dive into where you're getting the information for this, right? And so we need to go back up the article a little bit because it talks about the romance of cacao and how to do a tasting and things like that. And it says here that less than 1% of the world's cacao production is believed to come from true Criollo trees. Again, we have no definition for what a true Criollo is, right? So does that mean it's a genetically pure Criollo? There may not be any wild populations of Criollo in existence anywhere in the world. There may be feral populations, so previously domesticated and now just not tended. So, for example, I was in the Hacienda Tranquilidad, which is in the Beni, the eastern Beni of Bolivia, and it turns out that what we think of the wild cacao, the cacao silvestre of that part of the world, may not actually be wild. It may have been introduced 300 or 400 years ago. It may have been farmed. There's evidence of some sort of planting strategies in terms of spacing and things like that. So the wild cacao of the Beni may not be wild. It may have been introduced before the arrival of the Europeans, and then after the population collapse, just let on to its own devices. And so are there truly wild populations of Criollo? Maybe, but maybe they're feral. So we need to go and investigate these things, investigate these claims. So why Criollo nearly disappeared? Let's stop that. Let's go and look at my contributions. What I wanted to say is go read this, right? You have the full text here. And you can say, you can go and, with a critical eye, what questions does this article raise in your mind, right? So is there a claim, and how do we go and verify that it's true? And so, but the broad topic, where did the plant we now call cacao originate, is a question whose answers, rooted in an increasingly better understanding of the cacao genome, have been emerging since 2008's pioneering paper, The Geographic and Genetic Population Differentiation of the Amazonian Chocolate Tree, the Ibromo Cacao L. And this is a little footnote here. You can click on it, and it says the L stands for Linnaeus. He named it, and so he got his name associated with it. So what I'm thinking about this article, right, is an introductory consumer-facing essay. It's broadly correct. It captures rarity, flavor profile, fragility, and the idea that Criollo cacao is historically important and now rare. However, it relies on now outdated concepts of Criollo and glosses over the key genetic, geographic, and historical nuances, which is what I'm going to go and talk about here. The key genetic, geographic, and historical nuances. And again, what I want to say, right, is that I am taking a look at this in the same vein as I did with my recent looks at Maïa ceremonial cacao. There's a link here, and in the recent look at what it is that Pono Cocoa is doing. It's how do we evaluate the claims that are being made, right, and understand how much we can rely on them, right? And what I want to say is, after going through all of this, what I'm going to say is I have provided source citation, right? And they're in reverse chrono, the most recent to the oldest first. So if we go back to 2002, there's a paper which is published Cacao domestication, the origin of the cacao cultivated by the Maïa. And so this is a publicly available paper. You can go take a look at it, and you can go figure out what Juan Carlos Montemayor and his team discovered about that with links to related articles. Right? And so one of the things is I downloaded these articles and used them as source for what is I'm doing. And I said, here's where I got the information for this article. So here's the 2002 article, right? And here is the 2008 article that I referenced, right? Which is the geographic genetic population differentiation of the Amazonian chocolate tree. And you've got sort of a deep dive into genetics, including this really interesting map, which talks about the origin of the 10 different clusters that the Montemayor team discovered in terms of their genomic analysis using techniques rooted in something called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP tests, they're often called. And what we do is here are the 10 different clusters, but we have particularly two families, two structure groups. And the families are differentiated by the number of base pairs in the genome, with the Criollo genome having fewer base pairs than the Forastero genome, having a structure group having, and then a melanado being a type of Forastero. Right? So, for example, Nacional is functionally a Forastero. So we sometimes hear Nacional being added to the Criollo, Forastero, Trinitario, Nacional. No, we understand now that Nacional is a type of Forastero. So this gives us a little bit, and one of the things that's really important to understand is to look at this cluster, this cluster here, which begins to talk about, one of the things we know about genetics is that the closer you get to the center of origin, the greater the diversity is going to be. And so we're looking at this. This is not likely to be the home of cocoa. This is not likely to be where cocoa originated. Cacao originated. This is in Brazil. This might be, is this near the modern state of Pará? Not entirely sure, but this is the Amazon going this way. So you get an idea that the origin of cacao is not likely here. The origin of cacao is out in this direction. So Iquitos is a port town in Peru. We have other names that we now know associated with cacao. Obviously, Amelanado, Cotamana, Corare, Guiana, Marañón, Nacional, Nanayampus. So these are the varieties, the families of cacao. But they're broadly in two families, right, which are Criollo and Forastero, based upon differences in the number of base pairs in the genome. So we're looking at an origin sort of in the upper Amazon River Basin, somewhere around the modern day borders of Ecuador, Peru, Colombia. That looks to be where cacao originated. And that's what this paper talked about in 2008. Again, this is the one published just a year after Discover Chocolate was published that sort of demolished in my mind, the differentiation or the structure that the industry had been propagating for close to 2 decades, that there are 3 families, Criollo, Forastero, and Trinitario. Right. I was fortunate to have had the opportunity to meet Juan Carlos at the Frontiers in Cacao Science Symposium at Penn State University in 2015. And I did reach out to him and asked him for some additional sources for this post. Right. After 2008, which is when this post was done, we go to 2018, and we're looking at a paper which you can now find in Nature, Communications Biology. It's the population genomic analysis of the chocolate tree, providing insight into its domestication process. Right, so more recent research. So this is a decade after Juan Carlos Montemayor's paper. This is the paper that Montemayor said, you need to go read this. Again, I downloaded it and used it as part of my research here. And domestication is really, really important. Right, so we have the where did it originate and when did humans start using it? And when humans started using it, did they start deliberately breeding it, hybridizing it, deliberately breeding it to meet their demands? And this paper starts talking a little bit about that. And there are some names that I recognize here in the research. I don't know the primary author, Omar Cornejo, but Arthur Cornejo, excuse me, but Juan Carlos is listed on the paper. And then there is this paper here, which is a revisited history of cacao domestication in pre-Columbian times, looking at archaeogenomic processes. And so Claire Lenode is a primary author on here, but I did have a chance to meet in person with Dr. Francisco Valdez when I was in Ecuador in 2022. He gave a paper talking about his research around the usage and domestication of cacao in the Zamora Chinchipe province, which is in southeastern Ecuador, around a site which is called Santa Ana La Florida South. And so we're talking about his research and theories about how cacao, let's put it this way, with this area, Santa Ana La Florida, is the oldest known, archaeologic evidence of the usage and domestication of cacao by humans. And it goes back to over 5,500 years before the present, maybe 5,900 years before the present. I had a chance to meet Dr. Valdez in 2022, not only at the presentation that he gave, but a ceremony. He was given a special recognition by the governor of Guayaquil while I was there. And we had a chance to talk about this research, and we've corresponded since, right? And so Dr. Lenode is also a co-author on some of these other papers. And so, but this is 2024. And so I wanted to go and say, oh, here are the source citations. So what did I do? I downloaded all of them. And then I have a process that I have developed, right, which I have described before. And the process is, over the course of the last year, 18 months or so, I've developed a series of prompts for LLMs. And the prompts are called summarize, explain, analyze, and fact check. And there's a new one I'm starting to use called rewrite. But what I do is I took all 4 papers and used them, right, as input to a Claude prompt. And then I used all of the papers and used them as input for ChatGPT. So same prompts, 2 different LLMs. I got different results because they have different backgrounds and they both have different histories with me. And then what I did is I downloaded those, the prompts, the outputs for the prompts in separate documents, and then use those as input to another prompt, this time on Claude, that says, compare the two, find me the places where they agree, find me the places where they disagree, and then create a summary, right, that represents the best understanding of the 2 documents, right? And then did that output and ran it through rewrite to say, get rid of the most obvious aspects of, what AI generated text looks like. Most of the obvious artifacts, and it has a history of me, and it knows what my voice and background is. And so it more closely resembles the way I write. And that's what I did, right, in examining this. And I also used this, and I said, all right, now that you've got all this done, compare it with what's said over here. Right. So where is the article broadly correct? Where is it incorrect? Where can we learn? So I'm trying to understand, right, in detail. Now, why am I doing this? Right? Because for me to go through and read 4 research papers and to be able to do a synthesis of them is challenging. What's more important is that, number one, the prompts that I use to be able to analyze these documents are based on, my 25 years of experience. So I'm trying to put my subject matter expertise into the prompts, right? And then when I get the results back, what I'm doing is I am asking further questions. And because what the output of the LLM prompts is doing is it's suggesting new questions for me to ask based on my experience. And so I'm not taking the output of this at face value. What I'm doing is I'm using the output, comparing the output from two different models, finding out where they agree and disagree, and then going, oh, here's an interesting point. Can I use conventional techniques research techniques to find an answer? Can I find the answer within the research reports that are there just by doing keyword searches, among other things, within the research reports, and other kinds of techniques, drilling down into them. And that's the way that's the way I use LLMs to help me in my research, right? So I just wanted to let you know. And so here is broadly where we are, right? So, and again, what was fun for me, right? And if I'm a mistake, I want to know that my understanding is wrong. And it turns out that during the course of this research, again, I learned, I would say, listen, when Europeans came, they said that the cacao that came from where they were, right? That was called Criollo, because basically Criollo means from here, native, right? And forastero means foreigner, from far away. And so, but it turns out that it wasn't until the Spanish started moving cocoa around from Ecuador into Guatemala in the 17th century, which is where the distinction between cacao that was grown in Mesoamerica, so Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and Mexico, had to be differentiated from the cacao that was coming in from Ecuador. And it was then, so in the 17th century, the 1600s, that, and into the 1700s, that what we find is that, over time, the use of Criollo and Forastero began to be adopted, not earlier, not a century earlier, and hundreds of miles away, which is my original understanding of this. So this has been, so I admit that, I was wrong and all of those things. My understanding was incomplete. So I want to thank Chef Robert for inspiring me to go down this rabbit hole so I can improve my own understanding of it. So based upon all that process that I was describing, using two different LLMs, right, comparing the document the chef wrote and the four different source documents that I got. So here's what the top line summary is that the blog, right, leans heavily on the old three-family model and never engages with Montemayor's 10-cluster framework or the ancient versus modern Criollo distinction. So, and as I mentioned, if your source is primarily books like The True History of Chocolate and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles which cite back to The True History of Chocolate, this makes sense, right? That this, and I have to admit, in 2006, 2007, which is when I was writing my book, that's what I knew, right? I wasn't aware of the 2002 research of Montemayor, and the 2008 research was still underway, right? And I didn't know about it. So the blog repeatedly refers to Criollo, Forastero, and Trinitario as the three major cacao families. It's historically standard, but scientifically incomplete. So that's number one. It's just in terms of understanding. So it re-centralizes Criollo to Mesoamerica and treats it as a primordial family, despite strong evidence for a South American origin and a very narrow domestication bottleneck. Right. So, and again, this is the general understanding pre-2008 that Criollos were developed and bred, hybridized in Mesoamerica. They did not travel up from South America, which turns out to be untrue. That the wild tea cacao species, which predated the Europeans, and the ancestors, the ancient Criollo, right, are from South America, So wild tea cacao is most diverse in the upper Amazon, and this region is the putative center of the origin of the species. Ancient Criollo genotypes from Mesoamerica and Yucatan nest within South American diversity, strongly implying South American origin for the Criollo lineage with subhuman transport into Central America, with Soconusco and related regions being cradle of long-term Criollo-rich cultivation, but not the genetic origin of Criollo itself. Right? And so this is a summary of the reports of the findings of 4 different genetic research papers, the ones which I point to as sources for the document. The blog does not interrogate the myth of true pure Criollo re-modern hybridization. Right. So what it says is that Criollo in farms today is largely modern Criollo, a introgressed, so hybridized material, not ancient Criollo. Right. So it doesn't. So the blog article doesn't take a look at this. It continues to present the idea that that Criollo is one monolithic thing. There's not a thing as ancient Criollo and modern Criollo, which genetically we can prove that there is. So what I want to do is I want to reframe the narrative for you. I want to give you a way to, in the future, talk about Criollo. So the word Criollo is a colonial cultural label, not an indigenous taxon. I'm going to have to replace this word. I was editing this post until about an hour ago. So in colonial Spanish usage, Criollo broadly meant local Creole born here. So one way I like to think of it is I like comida típica y criolla, which is food which is typical for the place where I am, criolla. When you go into, I've been in Peru, I've been into Ecuador, and you ask the farmers if they're growing criollos, they will often say, see, yes, I'm growing criollos. And you have to ask them, I mean, have you tested them? Are they genetic criollos? Or are they the trees, and you call them criollo because it's what your grandfather was growing? And they say, normally, yes, it's because my grandfather grew them. That's why they call them criollos. They're the ones from here, as opposed to ones that might have been introduced right from a breeding program. So CCN 51 is a native hybrid from Ecuador, right? And so in that respect, you could call CCN 51 Criollo in a colloquial context, because if you're in Ecuador, it is from Ecuador, right? But we need to distinguish between the colloquial cultural use of the word and a more specific genetic use of the term, right? And that is where we're talking about this deeper dive. Are we using the term culturally, or are we using the terms in terms of modern archaeogenomic understanding? So early Venezuelan planters used Criollo to refer to their established local cacao type, and forastero for newly imported material, right? So perhaps the Amelinado forastero from the Amelinados from Brazil. Later, botanical writers simply lifted the folk terms and tried to refit them into a biological classification, right? Which is, yeah, that makes sense. Where did the terms come from? We find, people from these important places who have a history, perhaps over 100 years, who've been using the terms this way. And when the botanists come in, they see the way the language is being used, and they just adopt the way the language is being used. This makes an enormous amount of sense. So over time, Criollo becomes associated in planter discourse with high quality flavor, pale cotyledons, poor vigor and disease susceptibility, low yields, high labor costs, which is what we think of when we think of Criollo. So low yielding, no disease resistance, right? They require more labor, and they don't produce as much cocoa, and so they're expensive, right? And as diseases such as frosty pot and witch's broom bite into yields, the trees are massively replaced by more robust, and that's an editing artifact I need to go fix. As I said, I was working on this until just a few minutes before we went live. So genetically, Criollo is a narrow, highly homozygous. Well, homozygous means that the genetics are much the same, right? Domesticate, right, which means it has been bred, it has been domesticated, so it is the product of being domesticated, which is where the word domesticate comes from. So embedded with the upper Amazon, Colombia, Ecuador genetic complex. So it is not a separate subspecies, right? Modern, we have a Criollo family and a Forastero family, and these are genetically distinct. And we know they're genetically distinct by, among other things, the difference in the number of base pairs in the genome. So ancient Criollo genotypes are exceptionally uniform and closely related to some Colombian Ecuadorian Forastero accessions, which says that Criollos originated within the Forastero group and then were separated long enough so that they became distinct, and that the distinction happened, right, as a result of domestication. So as humans began to deliberately interbreed certain trees to deliver desired characteristics, what we do is we find that the genome shrinks, right? And we've seen this in corn and rice and other highly domesticated species, that you'll get differentiations within the larger group where, oh, there are huge differences in the base pairs of the genome depending upon the intensity of the breeding. So geographically, Criollo originates and is most reversed in the upper Amazon. Well, Cacao, not Criollo. So Theobroma. An early domestication episode in that region gave rise to a small founding population that was carried by human movement into Central America and southern Mexico, where long-term cultivations in Soconusco and Yucatan produced the classic Mesoamerican Criollo. However, right, it is the origins of usage and domestication are in the upper Amazon, and these trees were selected, right, by humans for moving north into Mesoamerica. And trying to go from Colombia, through the Isthmus of Panama, that space, right there, where what used to be where the part of Panama that used to be Colombia, it's escaping me the name of the Meriden Gap, I think it's called, is incredibly difficult. It can take months to traverse, and it's really, really very. I mean, there are no roads in the region for many, many reasons. But it might have moved over the water within the Caribbean as opposed from the Pacific up the north. So they would have gone to the Caribbean, and then it would have been traded into Mesoamerica from there. Right. So the label Criollo emerges as in colonial Venezuela plantered vocabulary as our local cacao, in contrast with Forastero introductions from Ecuador and perhaps also from Brazil, from Pará, which is where the amelinado is. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, it progressively diluted by hybridization and disease-driven replacement. One of the things that the blog post talks a lot about is porcelana. And so porcelana is not separate from Criollo. It is a localized, historically ancient Venezuelan Criollo lineage that has since been heavily hybridized with other groups. Right? So let's go jump a little bit, because I want to talk about this notion of hybridization, and over the 19th and 20th centuries, actually going back into much earlier than that, in the development of Trinitarios, which I want to go and talk about. So one of the things, however, it does say is that modern molecular work shows that this folk taxonomy is biologically imprecise, and that pure Criollo is exceptionally rare. So one place I saw this show up was in Mexico, in the state of Tabasco, and a very important farm whose name is escaping me at the moment. I had it just a few seconds ago. And yes, right, Lynn, the Darien Gap. That's right. So yeah. Thank you very much, Lynn. I struggle for them. As a matter of fact, completely coincidentally, I was watching a YouTube video about the Pan American Highway, and which is supposed to go from someplace in Alaska all the way down through Chile into Tierra del Fuego, and it's incomplete, right? It comes from Alaska through Canada into the United States, where the entire U.S. highway system is a part of the Pan American Highway, and it goes into Mexico, which is the first country to complete their continuous roadway from one border to the next border, and it goes into Panama. You can cross the Panama Canal on a bridge, and you can take it to the edge of the Darien Gap, and the Pan American Highway ends, right? Because, well, among other things, it's a biological buffer. It's keeping um, cattle which from South America, which might have hoof and mouth disease, from coming north. That's one reason, but it's an incredibly treacherous area. And if you were to take, a modern 4-wheel drive vehicle, it can take 3 months to be able to go from one end to the other, right? And anyway, so I know about the Darien Gap because I was watching this other video about the Pan American Highway. So it's strange where you make all this kind of stuff, all these things come together. But Lynn, thank you very much. And Lynn is in Panama. She's a friend of the Chocolate Life. She's we've done a number of things together. She's been she was a regular contributor to episodes of the Chocolate Life on Clubhouse, which is a podcast series that I did audio only before I started doing these on video. And I believe we may have done something on the Chocolate Life Live as well. So Lynn, great to have you here. Great to hear from you. Thank you very much for doing that. But what I want to do is jump really, really quickly down to here and talk about Trinitario. Right? So what is Trinitario? So Trinitario is specifically, right, a deliberate cross between cacao varieties which were growing on the island of Trinidad, and there was a blight, maybe Phytophthora, right? But there was a blight in Trinidad, and the monks in Trinidad, I believe they were Capuchin monks, brought in Amelinado forastero varieties and started deliberately crossbreeding them, right, to increase disease resistance, right, and try to keep as much flavor as they possibly could, right? And so Trinitarios are Criollo forastero hybrid populations, right, from Trinidad, right, and that Trinitarios have since become a broader, globally replicated breeding concept rather than being limited to the island of Trinidad. So one way to think about it is that any deliberate Criollo forastero cross is, right, a Trinitario. That's one way of thinking about it. The Trinidad Cocoa Marketing Group wants to distinguish something called true Trinitarios, which are Trinitarios which were in fact hybridized on the island of Trinidad. Right. So in modern practice, especially in breeding and genetics, Trinitario is used functionally to describe any cacao genotype population with mixed Criollo and usually lower Amazon forastero, right? Selected to combine improved vigor, disease resistance, and better flavor than bulk forastero variety. So let's talk about Trinitario in that way. It is not a distinct population, which is one of the things that the Montemayor research in 2008 suggested. Criollos and forasteros, and Trinitarios are hybrids of forastero and Trinitario varieties. And many Trinitarios that are in widespread cultivation have lower Amazon hybrids, for example, Amelinado in their parentage. So, right, just wanted to make sure that we understood what that is. So true or ancient Criollo survives only in a tiny number of trees and lineages, mostly in Central America and Northern South America, right? And a few ex situ plantings. So ex situ means plantings that are outside this area. So in situ means in place, ex situ means somewhere. So there might be so if we look at the On the island of Trinidad, there's a germplasm bank, and what we might do is we might find some, quote unquote, true or ancient Criollo trees in that gene bank. There are other places in the world that might preserve these trees. That's what we would mean by an ex situ planting, right? But one of the things we've learned is that you can take a look at something, right? The phenotype, what the outside characteristics is, and you might get an idea about what the parentage is, but you can't know the parentage until you actually do genotyping. We actually go and look at the genomes. So you sequence the genome of that particular tree or those particular pod in order to understand, what the parentage is. And so this is what happened down in Mexico. We have a variety which is known as Carmelo. It's been trademarked. And otherwise, in the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture, it's called a C1. So it's accession number 1. And they thought it was a pure Criollo because it had 100% white beans, right? And that's not entirely true. There is a characteristic of some of the trees where the white beans had a little black spot in the middle, and the group that I was working in, we called them pintos because of this little black spot in the white beans. And after they did the genetic typing, they discovered that what they thought was pure Criollo was actually about a 60% Criollo, 40% Forastero hybrid. And once that was understood, fermentation changed to be able to deliver a better flavor profile. Because if you're fermenting it as Criollo and it turns out there's Forastero parentage, you may not be fermenting it properly. You want longer fermentation. Criollos generally have varieties with higher percentage of Criollo genes tend to have shorter fermentations. And that the dark spot in the middle of the beans might have been an expression of the Forastero parentage in this particular variety. So you have to be very careful. You look on the outside and you think it might be a Criollo. You open it up and, oh my gosh, it's 100% white beans. It must be a Criollo. You need to be really, really careful. Phenotyping doesn't work for you, right? It might give you an idea, but until you actually run the genetic analysis, you can't understand what it's going. So most, right, modern Criollo, right, in Nicaragua, they will often call that an acriollado, right? And what we find is that, some of the Cacao, right, some of the Criollos that were the parents of Trinitarios went from Nicaragua to Trinidad. They were hybridized, came back to Nicaragua, and were mixed back into the original parentage of ancient Criollos, right, to become more modern Criollos. And these mixes are sometimes called acriollados. And what you'll do is you'll find that they'll have some percentage of darker and lighter, even white cotyledons, including intermediate ones, which are locally called lila for lilac because they're pink, right? And they're incredibly beautiful. And these are, I saw this firsthand when I was working with Ingaman in Nicaragua in 2014 through 2017. So really, really interesting to see how the hybridization and the movement of cacao back and forth has diluted what we think of as genetically pure Criollo groups, ancient Criollo groups, which are extremely rare. And so when we think about the percentage of Criollo that contributes to the total population, the total quantity of harvest every year, true Criollos, pure Criollos, vanishingly small. Vanishingly small. Almost everything which is identified as Criollo is a modern Criollo, which is an admixture, which is most likely might not include deliberate hybridization, right, of cacao. It's just, the cacao tree is wildly promiscuous. You get two trees of different species together, you'll have midges pollinate, right? And all of a sudden it's just spontaneous interbreeding and hybridization, and you have no idea, if you have, which trees contributed the pollen to the pod. I mean, the cacao tree is unusual in the sense that you get multiple pollinators per flower, which means that you have, even though the tree has got one parentage, the seeds in the pod can have multiple parentage. It might be different genetics. I mean, if you open up a pod and slice it, by slicing it in half in cross section, you'll often see wildly different beans in the same pod. And it may be that, one reason for that, or perhaps the reason for that, is that the multiple trees contributed pollen to that flower, and what grew inside the pod represents this mixed parentage within the pod. So, right, it's complicated. Phenotyping is a challenge. Phenotyping will give you clues as to what's going on, but it may not actually give you an exact, right, genetic understanding of them. So most cacao worldwide is a complete complex admixture of several genetic clusters, which I just described. Cross-pollination is the rule, and grafting adds another layer of complexity. Classifying beans is at best a rough mark into the triad of Criollo, Forastero, Trinitario, is at best a rough marketing shorthand. And serious work on diversity, domestication, or flavor needs to be done in a Montemayor style population framework with explicit genotype data. Right? So that's where we want to go with this. In terms of understanding. So criollo is a term that is loosely used, right, to mean cocoa from here. And its use originated in Venezuela, in the Venezuelan planter populations, to refer to the high proportion of white bean cocoa, right, which is more delicate, that was growing in that area, that was transferred from there into places in Nicaragua, Honduras, Belize, and Mexico, taken up by the Olmec, Maïa, and Aztecs before the arrival of Europeans. But it was the arrival of Europeans, right, where the introduction of the word criollo came, and it came 100 years or so later, after the arrival, sometime in the 16th century. And it didn't happen in Tenochtitlan, which is where Cortez, right, interacted with Moctezuma. It happened, right, in Venezuela, where they were referring to the local cacao as opposed to the cacao coming perhaps from what we now think of as Pará in Brazil, and from Ecuador. So just that is the word criollo. The word forastero was used to refer to the cacao which was being imported into Venezuela. And to distinguish between, for example, I mean, I have a chance to speak with the people of Pono, and they have receipts dating back, they started making chocolate in 1884. Receipts dating back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they're buying Caracas cocoa. And we have, even older than that, we have recipes which refer to Caracas cocoa, which would have been most likely the indigenous, Criollo heavy genetics from that area, right, as one of the most highly prized cocos from that area. Forastero were these other things which came from other places, foreign, right? And that's an important distinction. And so the real question, I suppose, is I've been going for close to an hour on this, is do you have any questions about this? I've seen some places where I've incomplete editing and I need to go fix the editing on this source document. But I wanted to talk about the origin of Criollo as one of the two main structure groups of cacao beans, right? It's the upper Amazon River Basin, and it's in this area, which is near the modern day borders of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, and most likely in Colombia. There are some ancient accessions which are talked about in this article on the revisited history of cacao domestication in pre-Columbian times, which talk about a Colombian origin. So you can go take a look at it. Just, some really fascinating stuff here. So we've got domestication of Cupra Sioux. We have 3 new de novo assembled wild cacao genomes from the upper Amazon. Genotype, environment, interaction of genotypes. So there are, this is 2025, 2024, 2023. I mean, there's a lot more research which can be added to the 4 papers. I'm going to download these 3 papers right after I get done here. Right. But I do want to go back and thank Chef Quebeca, Robert, for publishing this. It's a good overview from a particular chef's perspective, trying to describe, often to his customers, who come into his shop, who come to his tasting, about what Criollo is. What I learned in the course of this research, and again, thank you, Chef, for inspiring me to do this, is that my understanding of what Criollo was how Criollo was being used, the word was being used, and where Criollo originated was incomplete. And from now on, I'm going to change the language I use to describe it, right? But that fundamentally, this triad, this tripartite distinction, which says there are Criollos, Forasteros, and Trinitarios, represents thinking that is not based in a modern genetic understanding of those terms. Now, am I advocating that the industry change the way they talk about it? Probably not, right? Because the chocolate industry, big chocolate, and the craft bean to bar specialty chocolate movement have spent, let's see, since 1984, right? Have spent, 30, 40 years in promoting these ideas, and promoting these ideas with tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of marketing dollars behind it. The way we think economically about bulk cocoa and commodity cocoa versus specialty cocoa is sort of rooted in this understanding, right? But what we need to understand is that from a geographic perspective and a genetic perspective, right, that Criollo and Forastero are fundamentally different from Trinitarios, that the 2 major families of cacao are Criollo and Forastero structure groups based upon the number of genomes in their base pair, or the number of base pairs in their genomes, right, are at the top level, and that Trinitarios exist as hybrids of those 2 varieties, right, in different percentages. And you have Criollos, which have mixed with Criollos, Forasteros, which have mixed with Forasteros, and then those have been hybridized naturally and deliberately. So the Trinitario is a very, very complex world genetically, as are all of these things. But we know where the Criollos likely originated. So Upper Amazon River Basin, not Mesoamerica. So that's an important understanding to take away from this this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, and also that the word Criollo is a result of colonialism. It is the Spanish planter culture in Venezuela in likely the 1700s, right, which used the term Criollo to refer to their local varieties as opposed to those varieties which are coming from other places, those other places being Forasteros. And so that's the other takeaway that I want you to take away. That's the other point that I want you to take away from this, is that how the use of Criollo and Forastero evolved as linguistic terms applied to locations, right, rather than as genetic descriptions. And if you want to go and become a member of the Chocolate Life, and you can do that, you can become a member of the Chocolate Life by going over and clicking on the join button. If you'd like to join at a minimum $42, so TCM annual rate, what I do is I have got a document which just lays all of this out in greater detail, including the source citations and all that kind of stuff if you want to do the research. So if you become a member of the Chocolate Life at the Team TCL member level between now and the end of March, what I will do is I will email you this document as a thank you. Just say, hey, this is why I'm signing up. I will send it to you as a thank you for listening to this episode. And with that, I want to say thanks, everybody, for joining me here today for this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, where we talked about the true origin of Criollo. Even if you're not going to join the Chocolate Life, there's a free membership. What you can do is stick a comment. You don't have to do it during the episode, but stick a comment, right? Especially on YouTube. If you have an opportunity to go and like this video, that would be great as well. Subscribe to the Pod Save Chocolate channel on YouTube. And remember, right, as I end every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, remember that if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you just might doing it wrong. You just might be doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody, ciao.